The clatter of a fork against porcelain sounded louder than it should have, echoing through the small diner in Ohio as Jacob Turner finally sat down, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on a plate he wasn't sure he deserved. The smell of eggs and burnt toast mixed with the ache in his chest. The kind that followed him everywhere lately. The kind that came from empty rooms and overdue bills and mornings that started too early for hope. He had come here because eating alone felt easier than pretending he wasn't lonely, because the silence matched the way his life had begun to feel after everything fell apart. As he stared at his food, barely touching it, a question drifted through his mind without warning, sharp and personal. What if this was you sitting here, worn down and unseen, believing your small pain was the biggest thing in the room? Would you even notice if someone else nearby was hurting more? Jacob had once been a man with plans, the kind that filled notebooks and late-night conversations. He had worked construction in Cleveland for years until an injury shattered more than his knee, stealing his job, his savings, and eventually his marriage to Hannah, who had grown tired of promises that kept breaking under the weight of reality. After the divorce, he moved south to a quieter town, hoping anonymity might dull the shame he carried. Instead, it only magnified it. Every morning felt like starting over without instructions, and every meal alone reminded him how far he'd fallen from the life he thought he was building. He ate slowly, mechanically, as if finishing the plate might somehow prove he was still functional, still worthy of occupying space in the world. That was when he noticed them, standing just a few feet away. A young mother named Rachel Miller, her coat too thin for the season, her posture tense with exhaustion, and beside her a small boy named Caleb, no older than 6, his hand wrapped tightly around hers as if letting go might make everything disappear. Rachel's eyes moved nervously across the room, calculating, measuring, deciding what pride she could afford to lose today. Jacob felt her presence before he fully understood it, a quiet gravity pulling at him. She leaned slightly toward him, her voice barely more than a breath, explaining without spectacle or drama that her child hadn't eaten today. There was no begging in her tone, only a fragile honesty that felt heavier than any plea. In that moment, Jacob's thoughts raced in directions he hadn't planned. He thought about his bank balance, about how he'd counted coins just last night, about how this meal was supposed to be his one small comfort after a brutal week of rejections and unanswered job applications. He thought about how unfair it felt to be asked for anything when he already felt so empty. And yet, as he looked at Caleb's thin frame and Rachel's trembling resolve, another question pressed against his heart. If you were in their place, if your child was hungry and the world kept turning its back on you, what choice would you make? The diner around them faded, replaced by memories Jacob tried to forget. Memories of his own childhood, of nights when his mother stretched meals and smiled through worry, of kindnesses from strangers that had once kept them afloat. Jacob pushed his plate slightly forward, his hands shaking as if he were stepping off a ledge. He didn't make a show of it, didn't seek gratitude or recognition. He simply made room, offered what he had, and felt something inside him loosen for the first time in months. Rachel hesitated, her eyes filling with tears she fought hard to hold back, the kind that come from being seen after too long in the shadows. Caleb's face changed in a way that broke Jacob open completely, surprise giving way to cautious joy, as if hope were a thing he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch. Jacob stayed seated as they ate, pretending to focus on his coffee, but every small movement, every quiet bite, stitched something tender back into his fractured spirit. As the minutes passed, Jacob realized he wasn't hungry anymore, not in the way he had been when he walked in. The ache he'd carried felt different now, softened, reshaped. He listened to the hum of the diner, the scrape of chairs, the ordinary sounds of lives intersecting for reasons no one could fully explain. Rachel's shoulders slowly relaxed, the tension easing as if the weight of the day had lifted just enough to let her breathe. Jacob thought about how close he had come to closing himself off completely, to letting bitterness define him. He wondered how many moments like this he had missed by keeping his head down, by assuming his pain excused him from noticing others. Change, he realized, didn't arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes it came quietly, disguised as inconvenience, asking only for a little courage. When they finished, Rachel gathered her son, her gratitude expressed through trembling hands and eyes that said more than words ever could. She didn't linger, knowing too well how fragile dignity could be. Jacob watched them leave, the bell above the door ringing softly as they stepped back into the cold. The emptiness of the booth across from him felt different now, no longer a symbol of his loneliness, but a reminder of what had just passed through it. He sat there long after, staring at the smudged tabletop, feeling something unfamiliar rise within him. It wasn't happiness, not exactly, but a quiet sense of purpose. A realization that even in his brokenness, he still had something to give. That night, Jacob walked back to his small apartment with a lighter step, the streetlights casting long shadows that no longer felt threatening. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether the job leads would pan out or the bills would somehow get paid. But he knew this. He had been part of a moment that mattered, a moment that reminded him he wasn't invisible, that his choices still carried weight. Kindness, he understood now, wasn't about abundance. It was about willingness. And sometimes in giving what little we have, we receive more than we ever expected. Before the story ends, take a quiet moment and tell us in the comments what you would have done if you were sitting in Jacob's place that day. The world keeps moving fast, often too fast to notice the small, aching needs around us. But stories like this remind us that a single act of compassion can ripple farther than we imagine. If this story truly touched your heart, gently consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. Not out of habit, but as a promise to yourself to choose kindness when the moment finds you.